This is the Be One Change One podcast, where our mission is to help listeners define values, practice integrity, and inspire change.
Our vision is to mentor men and empower them to achieve more by taking responsibility for shaping their own lives.
He's CAS, an evolving man who has been shaped by adversity and continues to grow through his imperfections.
And he's Roscoe, an imperfect work in progress that tries to suck less every day.
Between us, we have over 40 years of Air Force fighter pilot experience with countless hours as trainers, instructors, and mentors.
Join us and learn to take responsibility for your own life as we dive into subjects from leadership to resilience to vulnerability.
Be the one who changes their course. Be decisive, driven, and purposeful. Set the example for others. Lead. We wish we'd had this show when we were younger men.
Be the one.
I think, gosh, maybe it was 4-letter F words.
Yeah.
Way back when, whatever episode that was, like 3 or 4. Somewhere in there, I said, hey, checks in the mail. We got an episode on grief coming up and the grieving process. Because that whole episode about 4-letter F words was about your mental health, really, and how you compare yourselves to others in a lot of ways, and how that can lead to depression, and we went through quite a few of those.
Yeah.
I would encourage listeners to go back and check 4-letter F words out very early on, like single digits for the episodes. But yeah, I promised a episode on grief, and here we are 100 episodes later that maybe we actually get to it.
Well, I think we've talked about this in pieces over the course of the last year and a half, but I don't think we've ever just talked about this, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to talk about grief was because I lost my mom a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Talk about that for just a minute,
I think that whole process just caused me to have a little bit of reflection just on, the nature of relationships and how things can change over time. We're also getting to the point in our lives, I don't know if you feel this way, but I definitely do, where like people are starting to die. Like we're starting to lose people. I have friends that are getting sick, friends that are getting like cancer and, like life-threatening illnesses.
Yeah.
That
aunts
people
and uncles and
dealing with. And so, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about grief, because I don't think that's something that just in general as men we ever talk about. And the other thing too is I don't think that our culture or our society really builds space for men to experience grief. So like for instance, if you're in a family, maybe you're, a son or a daughter or something like that, or maybe you're a husband and something happens to, somebody close in the family or your extended family, like the kind of cultural reference we have for that is that you're supposed to be the stoic, brave, strong, take care of everybody else, push through everything, kind of a person. And there may be situations where that's the case and you need to do that, right? And you've got to compartmentalize for a little bit and do those things. Because maybe you're the person that has the, emotional regulation, the self-discipline or the fortitude to kind of carry everybody else through a period of that. But I think what often happens in a lot of situations is I don't think we really appropriately deal with grief as men. We just we compartmentalize, we lock it away. We don't really take the time to, because it's not comfortable, right? There's no fucking joy or fun in sitting in grief, and letting yourself experience the emotions around, that loss or that feeling of loss or the yearning that you have for what could have been or what wasn't that you wish would have been, in a relationship, and so those are kind of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit today, because it's kind of ambiguous. It's another one of those gray things, and I love the fact that we have the 5 or 6 stages of grief, blah 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 blah. We love to categorize things as a people, because it makes things logical and it helps us make sense of things. But I think grief is one of those things where, sure, dude, there's 5 or 6 stages to grief, whatever. But it's not like a process where you're in phase 1 and then you go to step 2 and then you go to step 3, right? It's not linear, right? You can be in 1 through 4 all in the same fucking day.
It's kind of like your gender. It's on a spectrum.
Yeah, it's on a spectrum. Good job, Roscoe. We'll get you there.
Hey, dark humor, man. We were talking about that earlier, right?
We'll get you there.
I want to make a comment there on something that you said earlier, where you're talking about, men and we'll just focus on males for right now. And why it's not okay or why it's accepted that, we grew up in the era or in a time when real men don't cry. Right.
Yeah.
And that was kind of
show emotion.
Yeah. It was kind of like our dads were like, they were tough and they were tough on us and society was tough on us, and like you're supposed
society
to be
was tough on them.
Play football and don't cry. And I don't care if you have to carry your arm into the doctor, you take some Motrin, you duct tape it back on, you go back to work, Yeah. But I remember when my back went out, man, and this was in 2019. And I remember being face down on the bed. Katie had gone to take a shower. I went in to lay on the bed while she was in there just so we could talk. And when she got out of the shower, I was full on crying in the bed, like wailing in pain, and ended up going to the emergency room or whatnot. Well, she sent out, I guess she took a picture of me at some point, and I think I was in the ER in a wheelchair with like my legs stuck out like this because it was hurting so bad. And when one of my sons texted her back, not in the group chat, texted her back separately, and he goes, "Wow, this is so fucking weird because I'm not used to seeing dad not okay."
Yeah.
And that was like, I still remember that. Like, we talk all the time about, we want to be the example for our kids, and other people. We want to carry ourselves in a way that would make them proud. And if they turned out to be like me, I would be proud of that product,
Yeah.
And that hit me, and I still suck at it. Katie and I had a discussion this week where, I'm not an emotional creature. I'm not an emotional person. I tend to swallow hard and bottle that shit up.
Yeah.
And like just keep smashing it and smashing it and smashing it until I shit it out eventually.
Yeah.
But on the flip side of it, my kids notice that stuff. Other people notice when you're not okay. And I think it's okay to be not okay.
It is. And right. So, it goes back to some of the conversations that we've had around vulnerability, right? Which is hard. It's especially, I think, as men, it's tough to show vulnerability, you know? But I think it's also important, just as a sidebar on what you're talking about, Roscoe, I think it's also important to have, you don't need to be crying at every turn, right? You don't need to wear your emotions on your sleeve necessarily. But I think I've found that there are great times to show vulnerability with your own kids, So, and I think it's really good as a man to demonstrate that, especially if you have sons, and even if you have daughters, right? To show them points of where, it's okay. It's okay to be mad sometimes. It's like, I've sat down with my boys before, and I'll be like, "Yeah, dude, I'm really upset," and it's okay. Like, I'm allowed to be angry, or I'm really sad, because we lost this person, or this has happened in life, or this is the result of a relationship. I'm really sad. I've had. I remember after a really close friend of mine died on his first anniversary of his death. I took my boys outside and we threw a nickel on the grass, and I sang an old Fighter Pilot song, and I could barely get through it because a bunch of emotion hit me. And I could see both of my sons looking at me like, what the fuck is going on, man? I've never seen dad like this, especially in Fighter Pilot role or mode, But like, I think that was impactful for them, to be able to see, that it's okay to show emotion, man. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss someone, to have a yearning for the loss of a relationship.
Yeah.
Or a friend, or whatever the case may be. I think that's really hard for us to do, though. I just think we're taught to be tough and strong and stoic and not show any. And the reason why is because I think we tend to view vulnerability as weakness, which, as you and I have talked about on the podcast a bunch, it's really being vulnerable is one of the most courageous things you can do. With the people that you love, especially, and again, you don't share that vulnerability with everyone. It's not for everybody, but for the people that are close to you, the people that you have that are close to you in your life, I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing at the appropriate times to show that vulnerability, because we're all only human, man.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need support too. Sometimes we need a hug too. And somebody to come along and tell us that it's going to be all right.
Let's let's do what we do here and go root cause analysis real quick. And you said that you think it's the weakness piece of it. You don't want to show weakness. I would take it one layer deeper and say it's a fear of judgment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and maybe weakness is one of those judgments, and maybe there's different ones,
Yeah.
I don't think anybody just wakes up in the morning and go, let me see what I can throw out into the universe today, so I have people judge me all day.
Right.
Yeah. Although, in a way we do, and that's sort of the construct of social media, right? Is you throw out to the metaverse, some segment of your life. Maybe it's positive, maybe it's negative, maybe, one of your family members died, or like I put out a picture the other day because I was happy. I was sitting on my back porch writing, and we have a hummingbird that's building a nest, and she's about to lay an egg. And 2 years ago, we had the same thing. And on the same sign on the back porch, on one side is an old nest, and on one side's a new nest. I was like, man, this is really cool. I'm actively watching this happen over the course of a couple of weeks here. But anytime you throw something out there like that, be it just a random comment, a picture of, you and your family out in front of church, doesn't matter what it is, you're inviting judgment from other people. And some people are going to scoff, and some people are going to praise it. And that's it. But ultimately, I think, one of the things that you were getting at there was the vulnerability piece it's the fear of judgment in a negative sense. I don't want them to view me as weak or incapable of being the leader of my family, or, something. And I was taken back as you were talking. I was just sitting here thinking about when I went to that funeral. It's been a couple of years now, hasn't it? It's over a year.
Yeah, 2 years,
almost 2 years.
Yep.
Up in Iowa, and there's 20 of us standing there in our uniforms, in our flight suits, in formation, not a dry eye in the place.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm looking around, going, man, these are some of the most hardened warriors that I've known. Some of the best fighter pilots, some of the best bros. They're the king of the bar, and they're the most sharp tactical sword that you could hone. And here they are, just deflated.
Yeah.
And that was powerful, man. I actually wrote I went to my room that day after, we went and did like a little gathering at this place and ate some food and told some stories and stuff. And I was a little tired anyway, because I'd been up early that morning. And I went back to my hotel room. Katie stayed there. I went back to my hotel room by myself, and I just wrote out like 1,500 words capturing that moment or a little bit. And I named that passage. I never published it. I never put it out to anyone. Nobody even knows it exists until now. But I named it The Box. And the reason I named it that was I remember standing there in formation as the brother-in-law, who is also a retired fighter pilot, Patch, like very well regarded in the community. He gave this really eloquent speech, did the nickel on the grass thing, that whole thing. And we each went up there and we put a nickel on that box. Everybody did. I actually brought a bag of nickels and passed them out to people. And so we all had them in our zippers of our flight suits. And we went up there one by one and we placed a nickel in that little box. And it was just a little like 6x6x8 polished container that dude was in. And man, that hit me hard. I was like, holy shit, dude. Like, your favorite rocking chair, your plaques on the wall, your golf clubs, your fucking sports car, none of that shit was in that box.
Yeah.
I think just him.
That's a great picture to paint, right? Because there's the sum of it all.
Yeah.
So why worry about that judgment? Why worry about showing a little bit of vulnerability, dude? Like, you get this one opportunity, and you know what? Maybe if those individuals could have been a little more vulnerable and not worried so much about the possibility of shame or judgment, then they could have gotten the help that they needed to get through what they were going through. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it is. So anyways, but going back to grief, I think what's important to understand is, like, it sucks, right? There's no piece of grief that's good, because there's a lot of emotion that comes with it. And I'm going to reference Brene Brown because I think she kind of breaks it down in some easy chunks, as far as you have the initial loss of that person or that thing, and loss doesn't just have to be a person. It could be the loss of a dream, right? We've talked about that before. And to be honest with you, that ambiguous loss, the loss of a dream, those ones are sometimes the worst, because they're so easily dismissed by everybody else. Oh, well, it's okay, man. You'll rebound.
You'll get over it.
You can go do other. You'll be able to find something else. You can do other things.
It's like Joe Biden saying, "Learn to code. You'll be fine."
and they don't understand, but they don't, like, people get very dismissive about that stuff, right? Because and they may not even understand just how important that might have been to you.
Yeah.
Or how much effort you had put into striving towards that particular goal. But there's that initial loss, right? And then there's that, for a lot of people, I think, especially when you lose somebody close to you, there's that feeling lost.
I have a great example of that.
Yeah, that absence of that person, right? That the and you go around the corner, or there were little things that happened on a regular basis that don't happen anymore, and you're reminded of that consistently, right? And then there's a yearning, right? There's a yearning for, having them back, or a yearning for what you had in that relationship that maybe you don't have in another relationship. Or it could be, in the case of, let's maybe somebody who never had a really good relationship with a parent or something like that, but always wanted to. And then that parent passes. There's that yearning for what could have been, that idea that you always had, that maybe it would come to fruition, around that sticks with you. So, but I think the important thing to recognize about grief is that there's no right way to go through it, right? I don't think that there's a right way. Everybody's going to handle grief differently, because the nature of the grief itself can be different, right? If we're talking about grief, some people react very strongly to the loss of a pet. Some people don't. Some people react, my mom's a great example, right? If I had lost my mom 40 years ago, the grief that I am feeling would be much different than the grief that I'm feeling now, right? Because the nature of our relationship had changed so much over the years. I think sometimes too, like, that grief, it's how things hit you, right? So, like, when I lost my dad, that was very sudden. And that was really hard on me, because my dad and I, over the last, like, the 2 years or so, maybe 2.5 years before he passed, like, our relationship had matured dramatically from what it had ever been in the past. I had come to recognize that there were some things that I was never going to get from my father in a relationship, because he was just not capable of it. But our relationship had really gotten strong in the last few years of his life. And so to lose him all of a sudden, like, it was not just the loss of him, but it was also the loss of, like, the direction that our relationship was going. And we were actually getting someplace that I'd always hoped we would be, and actually having him as a person in my life that I could rely on, that I could call, that I could ask questions to, versus, like, with my mom, the writing was kind of on the wall, just the way that her health had been declining, and some of the things that she was dealing with from a physical and a health standpoint. And so in some ways, there's almost a little bit of relief, because the quality of life that she had in front of her was not good.
Yeah.
And not conducive to her as a person, or, like, her mental state, or what she needed with her own codependency issues and things like that. So, like, we're at the point where my sister and I are talking about putting her into kind of like a long-term memory care. But my mom's so fucking codependent that, like, being separated from family would have been devastating to her if she remembered it. But sorry. So, right, like that grief, I think it comes in different forms, but I think the important piece of it is to one go, you can't have expectations about, I don't think you can have expectations about, I'm going to get over this in a month, or,
Yeah.
all right, I'm going to give myself 3 days or
It
6
takes as
weeks
long
or,
as it takes.
yeah, just, you've got to go through that process. But I think the more difficult piece of that is if you really want to work through it, you've got to allow yourself the opportunity and the space to sit in some of that emotion.
Yeah.
To sit in some of that emotion of loss, the what ifs, the yearning, the feeling lost in that process. You got to allow yourself because if you don't allow yourself to just experience some of that and kind of allow yourself some space and have some self-compassion to sit in that stuff and kind of think through it, then you don't process it.
Yeah.
And what happens is, I think that's what actually extends the timeline of dealing with it. And it may not be something that's, in your face every day, but there's going to be those little pieces that come up here or there that all of a sudden are going to trigger that for you because it's something you haven't unpacked yet, something you haven't processed yet. And it's going to flood all that emotion back. And you're going to be like, what the fuck? Why do I feel like this?
Yeah.
Well, you feel like that, asshole, because you haven't fucking dealt with it.
Remember in Top Gun when Goose died?
Yeah.
Maverick was pretty shook up. And, he goes to the board. Well, Viper comes in there and he talks to him in the bathroom and says, hey, you fly jets long enough, something like this is going to happen, right? It's dangerous, all that shit. Take your time, da-da-da. Then he goes to the FEB or whatever, and they found no fault. And they said, you're cleared, you can go. And Viper immediately says, get him back up.
Yeah.
Man, that dude wasn't ready yet.
No.
Like he hadn't completely processed everything, and it played out there in the next few scenes where, he took out his anger on whoever the other guy was. I can't remember the short little black dude they stuck with him. I can't remember his name.
I don't either.
But anyways, I'll fire when I'm goddamn good and ready. He was obviously going through the anger phase, and there was that disbelief at first, and but that's a great example of somebody else put a timeline on your process.
Yeah.
And I don't think that works necessarily. Now I will say this though, a self-imposed deadline may not be a bad thing. And hear me out here. I know it takes as long as it takes, but if you can find some ways to start coping a little bit, you can call them distractions. You can call them, putting your mind elsewhere, put some of that energy into something else a little bit, going for walks, reading, writing, whatever your outlet is, maybe that helps a little bit. And if you can set a deadline to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to write for a couple of hours, and see what comes out. Remember we had Scott Deluzio on back in September, and he talked about that with when he lost his brother in Afghanistan. That was one of his things, man, is he just sat down and he started writing. He just started letting it pour out, because maybe as a man, he felt, some of that judgment and that fear of being vulnerable. So he did it in a private setting where he didn't have to display that to other people.
And I'll tell you what, and I don't think, and I think that's fine. I don't think you have to necessarily display it to other people. And I would say that, and this is going to be a great segue into another episode we're going to have. In a lot of ways, you're going to have to do this alone.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, if you lose somebody close to you, you're going to have that initial 4 to 6 weeks, whatever. Everybody's pouring out, people bringing dinner over, wondering how you're doing. And then when the funeral's over, people will check in with you every once in a while, and that's going to get less and less. And you're still fucking there to deal with the grief, right? So, and it's a very personal and individual process. But I think what you're getting at, Roscoe, is you got to set time aside to go ahead and work through it, right?
Yeah,
you
schedule time.
You got to schedule
time.
And
also, schedule other activities.
Yeah,
schedule activities that aren't like centralized on that. Go to the gym, pick up a new book. Whatever you need to do to allow yourself the requisite amount of time to process some of that shit, but also make yourself do something else. And it'll suck at first, I'm sure.
Yeah, it will.
And because that's whatever event that was that caused you to go into this grieving process is going to be on your frontal lobe.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to consciously think about it a little bit and set that stuff aside, compartmentalize that for even just a little bit. This is mindfulness. This is what we talk about when we talk about mindfulness. Those thoughts are there.
Right.
Okay, it's there. I'm going to set that thought over here for a minute, and I'm going to focus on this one thing. If it's not for 5 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, but that's 5 minutes to an hour that you're not thinking about the grief. And we know just through planning and executing and doing all these things that we know through our Air Force careers, we know that if you can step away from something for a little bit and then come back to it with fresh eyes, man, it's like a different problem. You see it in a little more clarity each time you do that.
Yeah. And I would say too, just do what so one of the pitfalls, if you don't deal with your grief, it can lead to other bad things, right? Depression, anxiety, all that other stuff, right? Or
sure.
other bad, so because dude, I've seen this so many times with losing friends and then watching what happens to the family, and so often that grief is the loss is so severe up front that what do people do? And it's human nature to a certain extent, right? But I don't want to deal with this pain, so I'm going to find other ways to make myself feel better. Alcohol, sex, drugs, whatever else it may be, and that can lead to a very slippery slope, right?
And what you're talking about, though, is you're talking about putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs to heal.
Yeah. So there's a difference between unpacking and processing and allowing yourself to just feel shitty for a while, even though it's shitty, so that you can deal with the grief, and just trying to find ways to make yourself feel good.
Yeah.
If you're just trying to find ways to make yourself feel good, you're not dealing with the grief, right? The other thing too is, some people like to memorialize. I'm not one of those people, but some people, having pictures up, having something that was sacred to that person in a place in the house that everybody can see, some people want the constant reminder of that person in their life. Other people don't, right? Like, I don't need a bunch of shit on my wall or a bunch of shit on my shelves to remind me of that person, because I have all these memories of that person. And if I want to touch that, I'll go back to those memories. Right. But my point in saying that is there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. You just got to do what works for you.
Yeah, dude, that's so true, man. And I had this thought. I'm sitting here kind of processing as you're talking. I'm thinking of a lot of different things, because when you said earlier, you said, like, it doesn't have to be the loss of a person. Obviously, this conversation is centered around you losing your mom. I get that, but it could be, a promotion that you thought you were going to get that you ended up not getting.
Yeah.
It could be
that ambiguous loss.
Like you said, giving up on a dream, or whatever it could be. It could be. This is a funny one. When I finished a book recently, I kind of went through that, because I'm going to miss those characters. I spent so much time with those characters and so much time in that world and in that story, that when I wrote the end, it was like,
yeah,
hey, I need some time. I need some space here. Luckily for me, I had another project going, so I put some of that energy, instead of dwelling on that, I put some of that energy into the new project. But one thing that I was gonna bring up was, how many times have you seen this? Like, something tragic happens in whatever way, something tragic happens to one of your friends, and the next time you see him, he's all smiles and looks as if nothing's happened. And you're sitting there scratching your nugget, and you're going, like, how is this guy okay? It'd be like us throwing a party after the funeral. Like, how is that okay? Well, maybe that dude is doing all this in private so that he doesn't project it in public. And that's okay too. If you want to sit in your room and go through this process by yourself with just your notepad, or staring at the wall with the lights off, whatever it is, and that way, when you step into public or into society, whatever your little circle is, maybe you can project confidence and dare I say, that you're okay because you're dealing with it behind the scenes. You're dealing with it in private. And I think that's okay too. It doesn't have to always be a public display of grief. Like, you don't have to prove your grief to some other motherfucker.
No.
You know,
and a lot of times,
and this is something that, God damn it, man, this is something that I get so pissed off when somebody says something like, well, you don't seem like you're upset. Well, fuck you. All right. Just because I don't show you doesn't mean that I'm not upset. I'm upset when I want to be upset, and I can come into this room and put on a smile on my face.
Yeah.
Just because I don't publicly display this shit doesn't mean that I'm not dealing with it in my own time. So fuck you for judging me.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? Sometimes, like we've talked about before, you have to compartmentalize. When I went through my divorce, I still had to go to work every day. I still had to be an instructor in a patch and an
Did you go in poopy
or
pants with a long face every day?
Yeah, and I didn't go in crying and
with
my head hung low, not able to do my work or get shit done.
But when you got home, you dealt with that shit.
But when I got you know,
exactly.
And what I found in that process too, like for me anyways, one of the ways that I've discovered that works well for me, just to throw out an example, in that process of grief is, you know, you start to feel something. And what I would do is I would just kind of find a quiet room in the house, go upstairs to the bedroom, whatever, you know, close the door. And I just sit down and I'm like, okay, what's going on? What am I feeling right now? Like, what is the emotion that I'm feeling? Because I've found that a lot of times if you can just give yourself the space, and it doesn't, once you start to do this, sometimes it doesn't take very long. But you just kind of go, okay, why am I feeling this way? And then you kind of recognize whatever that emotion is, happy, sad, mad, frustrated, disappointed, whatever it is, you kind of name it and you go, okay, well, and what's bringing that up? And then you start to recognize maybe what the trigger was that brought that up for you. And then I just let myself sit in it for a second and I accept that, yep, this happened and that's how it makes me feel. And then all of a sudden it just kind of leaves and then I move on. Like it's not like I have to sit there and, you know, cry for, well, sometimes I would, sometimes I could sit there and cry for 10, 15 minutes because maybe whatever the emotion was so overwhelming once I recognized it, and the situation that was wrapped up in, you know, was still so tender that, you know, it would spark that emotion in me.
Yeah.
But you kind of just let it out. And then all of a sudden, dude, it passes. And then you're like, oh, okay, I'm good now. And then press, right? That's kind of a good way to deal with it. But if you're sitting there and you're going, oh, I'm feeling this. And then you're like, no, I'm not going to feel this. Fuck that shit. You know, well, that's fine, dude. You can do that for a while. But it's like we've talked about before. Your cup only holds so much shit.
Yeah.
And the more you let pile on top, it keeps going and going. And eventually it's going to flow over. And when it does flow over, especially I think for men in most cases, that's usually not a pretty, and not just men, women too. That's not a pretty scenario, because that overflow is usually like it comes out in anger. And you end up yelling or screaming at somebody that doesn't deserve it. And you're yelling and screaming at somebody that doesn't deserve it. And the reason you're doing it is because you're not dealing with your shit, but you don't know how to deal with it. And so you're throwing it out on everybody else, right? Or you go out and get drunk and make some really bad fucking decisions, you know, and whatever the, you know,
but
the second, third order effects of that. So,
but you know what, though, what you're talking about, though, is like you're giving a great example of there's no textbook, there's no checklist. No. You know, you kind of have to figure it out. Now, there's a lot of good resources.
Roscoe, did you just say there's no checklist?
There's no checklist.
I'm so proud of you, brother. Yeah. Look at you.
I'm
That's
trainable.
Growth.
I'm trainable.
That's growth.
It's like me teaching my dog to fetch. But here's an example. Let's throw this out there. Kids grow up and move out of the house.
Yeah.
Like
that can be that ambiguous loss we're talking about.
That's a significant emotional event. You know,
it can be.
On one hand, you're super proud and you're like wringing your hands going, done, right? Did my job, prepared them for the real world and kicked them out of the nest. And they're going to crash a couple of times, but we'll pick them up, dust them off and put them back out there. But at the same time, like Katie does this quite a bit, actually. She looks at the pictures around the house of when the kids were little. And she goes, oh, I miss my babies. You know, that's, in a way, she's grieving. a little bit,
absolutely.
because that part of our lives is
That's
over.
that yearning,
right? It
right?
is. And maybe that's why grandparents attach to grandkids so much, because you're kind of going back and reliving those days
Yeah.
a little bit vicariously through somebody else. But, I know that we've dealt with that in our household. Maybe we're still dealing with it, with our kids grown and kind of gone. And this past weekend, last weekend, Easter weekend, we scheduled family time with the boys and had them out here. And unfortunately, Tyler's in Alabama and he couldn't make it. But we're sitting here, grilled out some steaks and potatoes, and had all the kids and girlfriends and everything over. And we actually sat down at the table, which is something rare for us. We don't really do that very often. We should do it more, but we're sitting there and, we're 4 or 5 bites into our steak or whatever. And I said, hey guys, I just want you to know that I am hyper aware that these moments are fleeting. They're getting fewer and with more space between, because, as they grow, their lives are changing. Caleb's 2 years away from joining the Air Force and getting commissioned and going to wherever the fuck he's going to go. Colin's 2 years away from his enlistment being over and don't know what that decision is going to look like. A PCS at minimum, separation, maybe college, who knows? Nikki, with work, I've got some opportunities that have popped up recently that we're actually considering. So life changes, man. And I know that it's a very real possibility that here in just a couple of years, we're going to be scattered to the 4 corners.
Yeah.
And that's going to be sad. That makes me sad. And I look at my dogs even, and my favorite dog, you're not supposed to have favorites, right? But Duty is the sweetest creature on the planet. He's like Hodor from GOT, man. He's just, everybody loves Duty. And one day he's going to be gone, and that makes me sad, and so I think that's normal and natural. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that as grieving. You think it's a celebration that our kids graduate high school, but at the same time, oh fuck, man,
dude. Well, but that's a great point too, because I think oftentimes, right, we contextualize grief as it has to be this massive loss, right?
No,
it
it's
has
not.
to be the death of a family member or somebody close to us, and that's not it. That's a perfect point, Roscoe. Is it comes in all shapes and all sizes, right? Retirement, leaving the military,
happy.
Everybody, right. But I think there is a part for a lot of guys when they leave where they're like, there's that what might have happened if I stayed in, right? That there's that
all the time,
that grief of, or the loss of just that camaraderie in a fighter squadron and getting to do cool shit and blowing shit up every once in a while, and so there's grief in that, and again, just goals and plans. Like when we interviewed Ice, right? Wanted to go to weapons school. I'm sure there was a little bit of grief for him around not getting that opportunity, right? So, and he dealt with it in his own way and made his own pivot and ended up being a T-bird, right? So it can also lead to other opportunities, right? Depending on how you deal with those things. I know for me in my life, like being at Embry-Riddle for my first year of school and then coming home and then having to stay home to take care of my mom, or to help take care of my mom, dude, that there was a grieving process there for me for a year or two, because that dream that I had of going into the Air Force, becoming a fighter pilot, I thought was gone. Because I'm working my way through college at this point. I'm not going full time. It's going to take me forever to get a fucking degree, and I'm just like, so there was a grieving process in that. And I think sometimes, like we were saying, those can be difficult ones too, because people it's so easy for other people to dismiss. They don't recognize, maybe the hurt or the pain that you have in losing that dream or not being able to achieve that particular goal. They say, dude, you'll be fine. You'll find something else,
nobody can tell you how important something was to you.
That's right.
Person, process, place, thing, ambition, award, whatever it is. Nobody can tell you, except for you, how important that thing was to you. And nobody is going to be able to put themselves in your shoes to experience the loss that you're feeling.
That's why it's so personal.
Or the reflection that you're feeling. It is. It's very personal. And as you were talking there, the one word that came up in my mind was selfish. because what you were describing was, you walked away from college to go back and deal with your mom and that whole situation, and you gave up on something that you were excited about and that you were putting a lot of energy towards, and the feelings that you felt were probably a little bit of resentment mixed in
Yeah,
there, and it was
absolutely.
a very selfish thing rather than being selfless and going, you know what, my mom needs this, da da da. It was about you, and that's okay. I think in the grief, when we talk about the grief itself, I think that's okay, man. It's okay to make it selfish. It's okay to make it
Yeah,
about you, because it damn sure ain't about anybody else.
that's right. Yeah. And you've got to unpack that stuff. I can remember going back there and I'm at community college, Green River Community College, which is, all the people that we used to make fun of because they went to Green River. Um, I'm working downtown Seattle, loading trucks from 10 at night until 6 in the morning with this group of men who are all, for the most part, in their 40s or 50s. And this is their life. This is what they do. Guys going up on break and smoking weed on the rooftop. Like these guys just, they get paid well, but it's a thoughtless job.
Yeah.
It's a mindless job. None of them are happy with where they are in life. And I'm looking around and I'm going, fuck, dude, is this is this my future?
Yeah.
Like, is this the sum of me right here? Oh, so demoralizing.
But dude, doesn't the universe work in mysterious ways? Like,
It does.
Universe, karma, God, religion, a higher power, however you want to frame it in your mind. But you know what, that episode that you just described wasn't the path that you planned.
Nope.
But brought you home, gave you a different way to look at things, motivated you in a different way.
It did.
And look at where you ended up.
Yeah, well, and there was a lot of life lessons that I learned out of that. And one thing that I'll point out in that process, because we're always talking about creating opportunities. But dude, here's the importance of keeping your aperture open and not putting all your eggs in one basket or thinking that there's only one way to get to someplace. Because I can remember working at Consolidated Freightways, and I was too young for them to hire as a contract full-time employee because of the way the contract language was for the union. I think you had to be 21 or something, and I'm 19, right? So they were going to offer me they were going to bring me on full-time, I was working full-time, but I wasn't a contracted full-time employee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they realized how old I was. So that door was shut.
Yeah.
Right. I went to Home Depot. They wanted the gal that was in charge of my group of folks wanted to make me a driver. Had to be 25 for insurance. I was 20 at the time. Door shut. Right. So those are small things, but had I become a full-time contracted employee with Consolidated, maybe I would have made some different choices, right? Maybe I would have just succumbed to, right? So you got to keep your eyes open, because sometimes those doors closing are actually kind of allowing you to move in another direction that's better, and to keep your eyes open and your the different pathways open to you, so that you can find your way back.
Well, I told you earlier, I think before we hit record, I told you I'm reading the Stephen King book, and it's not one of his novels. It's actually kind of a memoir type thing. And he was describing when he first got started, he submitted this. He was young. He was 10 or 11 years old, and he submitted this story to a magazine, and he got a rejection slip back. So he took a nail and put it in the wall and stuck that rejection letter up on the wall. And by the time he was about 20, the way he described it was the nail was so heavy with rejection letters that he had to remove the nail and go get a spike and put it in the wall to keep putting. And so for 10,
That's
15 years, he's putting rejection letters up on the wall, rejection after rejection. Every now and then he'd sell one. He'd make a couple $100 here or there.
Sure.
The book, his first big book that got picked up was Carrie, and he wrote out, I don't know, 10, 15 pages or so of it because it was on his mind, and hated it, wadded it up, threw it in the trash. And his wife picked it out and read it, put red ink all over it, and says, "Here, go try again." When he got home from work that day, he was a teacher. Says, "Here, go try again." and it ended up getting picked up, made him $500,000, like the rest is history, and so, it's those little moments that, that decision to not take rejection as final, to keep pressing through, to realize, or to get to a point where you're so critical of your own stuff that you're like, yeah, this is trash, and you throw it away, and then somebody else sees the brilliance in it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, like our lives, I think you and I both have great examples. And I know that, the people around us, we could probably pick any one of them and give great examples of when something like that happened, like, don't let that rejection be the end. Go through that process, sure, and it's sad. Nobody likes to get a 1-star review on their first novel or their first book. It sucks. Nobody likes to get a rejection letter from an agent that I spent fucking 2 days building a query letter to send to her. And within just a few hours, she sent it back and says, no, this isn't what we're looking for. Nobody likes that. It's sad. It sucks, but at the same time, it's part of the process.
It is. Absolutely.
Yep.
I wanted to go over just a couple of things that they talk about. So like that Brene Brown talks about, just key aspects. And we've hit on most of this, but just to maybe make it a little more succinct for folks that may be listening to this or in a place in their life where they're dealing with some of this. And the first thing that she says is just being willing to feel and express emotions fully. Like, just allow yourself to sit in it a little bit, dude. You've got to. If you don't let yourself get some of that stuff out of your body, and this is interesting because I was talking to Alicia about this, and she's been working on all this new practice called deep brain reorientation and all this stuff, and they're figuring out ways where, like, because she deals specifically with trauma, how the body actually stores trauma, and she was just saying, dude, if you don't deal with grief, your body will actually hold the shock of some of that in certain spots of the body, and it doesn't release it until you deal with it. So if you're having muscle aches and pains, or your neck's always tight, or like, some of that could be just unrelated stuff that you haven't dealt with, especially when it's related to trauma or something like grief. So you gotta express it. We've talked about this, accepting that there's no right way to grieve, understanding that vulnerability in grief is not weakness but courage, and then connecting with others and sharing your experience can be healing. Of course, that again goes back to what we were talking about. It's a personal process, right? But you got to practice self-compassion during the process. Seek support from trusted people who can hold space for your grief. And then I think this is really important because you see this in stories, right? You see this in people. But acknowledge that while grief may change us, it doesn't define us. I think of bereaved mothers that lose a child and never recover, because that loss defines the rest of their life, and it affects everything, their relationships with their husbands, other family members, their ability to function just on a day-to-day basis, right? Life fucking sucks. It's hard, and bad shit's going to happen sometimes. And your responsibility is to find ways to deal with it, to be vulnerable in that process, to be compassionate with yourself, and then press on. Learn what, like we talk about. Take the lessons learned and apply them to the next iteration, right? Don't let that shit define you.
Yeah, I would add 2 things to your list, not to second guess Brene Brown. She's a genius and I'm not. But Google says, I actually Googled this and I had a list pulled up so that I could
I'm proud of you.
Seem like I'm educated on this. But yeah, there was 2 things I think missing from that list, at least, maybe a pile on would be, don't compare your grief to anyone else. Let's say that, let's say you and Alicia have, a friend, a couple's friends, Francis and Susie, right?
Yeah.
Die in a tragic car crash. You can't compare your grief for losing the couple to Alicia's grief to losing the couple, because you both had different relationships. You had different experiences. You had different depth in there, so I don't think it's fair for me to mourn my Air Force career and compare that to you mourning your Air Force career. The other thing that I would throw in there to pile onto her list would be, don't forget through the whole process, don't forget to take time for some self-care. get your nails did, go for a walk, read something healthy,
Yeah.
or maybe not even healthy. Pick up a fucking smut mag, whatever
Whatever
it
you
takes.
need.
Whatever you need, man.
It's personal.
It is. And go read 50 Shades of Grey or go for a long run, go to the gym. Don't forget that part, because we see that too, man. We see people who retire from the military. This is a great example. Guys retire from, and gals retire from active duty, and that piece of their life that was so controlling and consuming is taken away from them.
Yeah.
And they don't know what to do with themselves. And they sit and they waller in their self-pity, and they watch Netflix and eat Cheez-Its. Ask me how I know. And they forget those little things, because, and I think a lot of it goes back to, at least for us, the example that we're using, or I'm using here, is, the Air Force they told you where to go, where to work, what time, what to wear, when to eat, when to shit. I mean, they controlled every part of that job, controlled every part of your life nearly.
Yeah.
And then it was taken away, and you're kind of left to your own devices, and you're like, well, now what do I do? I don't have anybody telling me that I got a PT test coming up in a month, so fuck it. Why exercise? And
Yeah.
hopefully it took me about 3 years to get, my back healthy again, and then get my mind healthy again, to where I was at a point where I'm like, okay, that's not me. I'm gonna go back to what I know, and I'm gonna start taking care of myself again, and start engaging my mind on other things. But there was like a 3 maybe 4 year period there, at least 3, where, dude, it was not good, man. I was drinking way too much. I wasn't reading enough. I wasn't, definitely wasn't exercising, and I looked the part too. Like when I looked at myself in the mirror, I wasn't happy with the reflection.
Yeah.
And that whole mirror test that I've talked about a bunch of times is take off all your clothes and stare at yourself for 60 seconds, and you'll find some things that you can work on. I guarantee it.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to get over that, to get past all that, and be able to really kind of step back, take a 30,000 foot view of like, dude, where is this going? Like you said earlier, you're like, I think as we get older, we're a little more logical about things, and we can kind of start to see the second, third order effects, be that through experience or training or learning or whatever. But as I'm looking at that whole situation from a 30,000 foot view, I'm like, dude, this does not end anywhere good. Right.
Yeah.
So I've got to make some changes. And luckily for me, I found the fortitude to be able to do that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and think of all the things that you've learned about yourself in that process, and like with writing and things like that maybe you weren't quite aware of, that have been so important to you now, that become such a big part of you, that are so much, have become such a great way for you to express, your own interests and ideas in yourself, and to create, right? Like, but
let me tell you a tragic irony of
that otherwise.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really great. New horizons and new ambitions and new things, right? Rekindled that thirst for learning a process, and learning how to get good at something. And that's all fun. But here's the irony of it all is sometimes Katie does this. Katie says this to me fairly often. She goes, I grieve the old Roscoe.
Yeah.
And sometimes I do too, man, because I remember like getting drunk was fun.
Yeah.
I didn't like the way I felt the next morning. And really that's the motivation to not do it anymore. Cause like tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up at, 6 o'clock, and I'm going to do what I do. I'm going to read for a little bit. I'm going to write for a little bit. I'm going to go for a long run or a jog or a workout. I'm going to go shooting with my neighbor. Like, I don't want to feel like shit and hungover, because it doesn't allow me to do the things that I really have come to love to do. So yeah, there is a little bit of grieving in the old version of you. Here's a secret, listeners, right? Let's go be one, change one. When you start to do some of the changes that we, or start to do some of the processes that we advocate here on the show, you might grieve that old person. You might grieve that old version of you just a little bit, because maybe that person was, air quotes, more fun. Or had different experiences or whatever. Like those days when I was doing that kind of stuff, I was out raging and four-wheeling and drinking my face off in the sunshine all day on the weekends, for like 2 years straight. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Now I spend a lot of time back here in my room by myself with my laptop.
Yeah.
It's a different version of fun.
Sure.
So yeah, there's potentially some grieving of your old self mixed in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just so I would say too, like the self-awareness. Just to go back to self-awareness for a second, I think self-awareness. I've learned this anyways. Just can help you with that grieving process as well. So, like one thing that I mentioned before was just like when I went through my divorce, figuring out a way on how to recognize and deal with emotion kind of allows me to do that easier and better now. But the other thing I learned too was like in the military, losing friends, going through that process, seeing other people go through that process. Like when my dad died, we flew back and he wanted to be cremated. And so, they're like, do you want to come back and see the body one last time? This, that, and the other. And no, I don't. I had no desire because I don't want to. I don't want the last thing that I remember about my dad to be, him on a slab, fucking dead, right? Like that's not the memory. That's not what I value. That's not what I'm going to treasure. That's not going to help my process at all, right? And you may feel pressure on that. Like so my mom had a massive stroke that basically destroyed the left side of her brain. So she could still breathe, but she was, for all practical intents and purposes, she was in a coma and was basically a vegetable at this point.
Yeah.
And so, it was just without doing any kind of life-saving stuff, putting a feeding tube in, this, that, and the other, it was just a matter of time before her body was going to pass. And dude, there was a lot of pressure in some ways. And I don't think it was mean-spirited, but there was pressure by sides of my family to fly up to Seattle and say my last words to her.
Yeah.
But for me, it was like, why? I could leave tonight and she might not be there by the time I get there.
Yeah.
Like there's no idea what the timeline is, right? She's not fucking there anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, she's brain dead. And I don't need to see my mom like that. Like that's not how I want to remember my mom, And if people have a problem with that, that's not my fucking problem.
That's right.
I know the way that I know the way that I want to view my mom and remember my mom, and that's not part of it. And so for me, it's just not, that wasn't worth it to me. Anything that I'd ever said, I'd already said what I needed to say to my mom. My mom knew how I felt about her. She knew that I cared about her, And so I say all that just to say, as you have a little more self-awareness, you can kind of maneuver through that so that you don't maybe make the grief worse than it should be.
Yeah.
And I also say that to say, don't feel pressure to do stuff that you don't want to fucking do in that process. And don't let other people put pressure on you to do things that you don't want to do in that process. And if they don't like it, fuck them.
That's right.
It's not about them.
Let it be selfish.
It's about what you need to do to move and maneuver through that shit, that shitty part of life, that shitty experience yourself. And everybody else can suck a dick. I don't care. And if you don't like me for it, that's your fucking problem. Like if you don't want to have a conversation with me about the whys behind it or my decision-making process, I don't know what to tell you. Fuck you. That's, be mad for, you can be, I don't care. Fuck you. I mean, be mad at me if you want.
It's so liberating for your mental health when you get to a point where you stop caring about what other people think.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And I'm not going to worry about it either, right? I'm not going to sit there and go, oh, well, maybe I should tell him why I made this decision. No. You know what? If you love me enough or you want to be in a relationship with me enough that you're mad about something and you have a question, ask the fucking question.
That's right. Yep.
If you don't and you want to make all kinds of assumptions about why I do what I do, then fuck you.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need that shit in my life anyways. I don't need relationships like that in my life. Did I mention I'm an introvert and don't have a lot of friends?
Oh, it's not because you're an introvert. It's because you're an asshole.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Always good to end a show on a CAS rant. Love that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, parting shots, I would say, take the time that you need, do the things that you need to. If you need to do them by yourself, fine. If you want to do it with other people, also fine. And let the system work. Let the system work. I had a buddy that I checked up on a couple of times through his divorce, and it was neat. Every time it was every like 3 or 4 months, we would talk, and I could see that he was working through the different stages. He went from denial to anger to acceptance, or what's the other one?
I don't even remember. It doesn't matter.
There's one where it's like, well, it'll work out, something like that. It's not quite denial, but it's sort of similar. But anyways, it was neat to see him work through that kind of stuff. And it took, a year.
Yeah.
Whatever timeline it takes, you may get over yours quicker than I got over mine, so to speak. And that's okay. So let it be selfish. Take care of yourself. Don't forget to get some sun on your face and get out in the sunshine and wind every now and then. I promise it'll make you feel better.
Yeah. And all I would say is, don't be afraid of the emotion. Sit in that vulnerability. Let yourself process it. And I think one thing that I would say too is, like, while we talk about the fact that this is a very individual process, a very personal process, and a lot of it you probably will do on your own. At the same time, don't be afraid to take advantage of the support structure that you may have around you. Those trusted friends.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That you may just need to call and go, "Hey, dude, I just need to talk to somebody."
Yeah.
Or don't be afraid in that process to try to build that if you don't have it. Like, that support structure can still help you through it, even though it's a very personal, individual process. So,
yeah. All right, man. What else you got on grief?
That's all I got, man.
All right. Well, be the one.
Be the change.
Thanks for flying with the Be One Change One podcast. If you got something out of this show, then be the one and share it in your circles of influence.
You can be our wingman through our website at www.be1change1.com. That's B and the number 1, change and the number 1.com.
We invite you to be the one and join our fighter squadron on social media at Be1Change1 on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can follow us at Paul Roscoe White on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, as well as Roscoe's website, www.paulroscoewhite.com.
You can email us from the website, and please leave comments, share, and ask questions, or leave ideas of things you would like to discuss on future podcasts. Most importantly, be the one that helps us win the algorithm by leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening on.
Thanks for joining. Until next time, be the one.